In this episode of the All Access Automation Podcast, I sat down with James Duez, co-founder and CEO of Rainbird. In the episode, we discussed Rainbird's journey and how they got to where they are today. We also spoke about the importance of deterministic, explainable, and transparent AI in today's world. We explored some of the trends that we're seeing in the market when it comes to client implementation, and also announced the launch of their new LLM in Oasis. It was a brilliant chat with some great stories along the way, and I hope you all enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the All Access Automation Podcast. My name is Niall Hannigan, and I'm delighted to be joined by James Duez, co-founder and CEO of Rainbird. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Niall. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's actually our second attempt to try and get this going. We had a little bit of a hiccup with a bit of a mix-up in the meetings, but delighted to be here. And how's your day been?
Been busy, always busy. Plenty going on in the world of AI. Keep everybody rushing around. So, yeah, all good.
Definitely good stuff. So, we always kind of have a bit of a meeting beforehand. Myself and yourself had a catch up last week and kind of discussing about what we could speak about. And you kind of shared a bit of literature that you had done, or a bit of a report that you had done as well. And then you sent over this kind of mysterious link as well about, this is a bit of fun, I suppose, based off the kind of article that you sent over. So, I wasn't too sure what you meant, to be honest, but then decided to click on it, and this is what came up here.
You turn these days, it's all about large language models. LLMs, right? And how we're going to revolutionize, everything.
It really does feel that way.
Yeah, and the potential is there.
And we ran out of internet. There we go. But anyway, that was a snippet from Notebook LM. Basically,
Correct.
Just created a bit of a podcast around the article that you'd done, and I think if it actually kept playing there, it probably would have done my job for me. So I'm glad that stopped. But is that something that you would use quite often with kind of the articles that you create?
Do you know, it's interesting. Google, created Notebook LM, which does many things. It's a nice research LLM powered tool. But one of the things it does is create this podcast with these two American characters that talk about whatever content you've given it. Mm-hmm. And I've had it make a podcast about my daughter's dissertation for her degree. But we actually have now started just giving it some of our white papers and thought leadership, just to create a bit of fun, engaging content, because, reading a 15, 20 page white paper is not everybody's cup of tea, but, driving home, listening to two people argue about a particular facet of AI was just a bit of fun. But the message within it's pretty important.
Definitely. And when you sent it over to me, I was actually in the office and started to play it out loud. And then it got everyone in the office intrigued, putting in random different articles, trying to get a podcast from it. So, it was something that was really interesting. You asked me to kind of listen to that and then also read the article and see which one you preferred. So different kind of content, I suppose, for people to consume. But yeah, really good. But anyway, delighted to have you on. A new partnership with Roboyo, kind of towards the middle of last year as well. And you were at our All Eyes event in Berlin last year.
We were, yeah. Thank you for that. We had a great time meeting not only some of Roboyo's clients, but also a lot of the international Roboyo members as well. And we've got all sorts of projects spinning up in different places together. So it's been a good start to the partnership.
Brilliant. Glad to hear. And yeah, there's opportunities in a lot of different regions as well, which is great. So like you said, quite international clients, which is great. But I suppose take me back to the start, James. Obviously, Rainbird and the foundations of it back in 2013 with yourself and Ben.
Yeah, do you know, it seems like such a long time ago. Well, it is a long time ago. We're in our 12th year. Ben and I had worked together in a previous AI business. We built out a solution with some other folks in the insurance space, which became pretty significant in a small world of automotive claims in the UK. We built a platform that ended up saving hundreds of millions of pounds for British insurers using knowledge rather than data as the foundation for an AI system. Mm-hmm. And I exited that business in 2013, and Ben very quickly left the business as well. And he had this idea for this business, and it was just codenamed Rainbird. It was just a kind of a name he gave it. about, wouldn't it be great if we could build a platform that anybody in the world could use to try and do what we've done in this insurance market? Take knowledge first as a principle and encode regulation, policy, what people know into an AI, have it learn from there. And in doing so, be able to digitize the kind of work that is traditionally left for humans, but with precision, determinism, which really means, consistency, and explainability at its core. So really AI for high stakes applications. And over the last just over a decade, we've scaled the business to now automate high level reasoning in a whole range of different domains.
Yeah, and I suppose that the interesting thing for me when I came across the company just last year was, you kind of think a company like that comes around with the whole hype of AI over the last couple of years, but how has that kind of journey been, I suppose, from starting back there to going through the different hype cycles, and then being able to kind of provide your offerings in a different way?
No, it's a really good question, because AI was never one thing. And I think, different people pay attention to it at different times. But, the term AI was coined in 1955, and it's meant very, very different things throughout history. And even in the 10 or 12 years since we've been going, AI has come and gone. So when we founded the company, it was off the wave of IBM Watson, which was the hype at the time. It had not been long since it had won Jeopardy, and everybody was very focused and thought, well, maybe this is going to be the future of AI. And then that sort of disappeared. Obviously, RPA robotic process automation became not really, there was a time when it was kind of, some people would perceive that as being in the AI space until, of course, they realized that it was rules-based. But that became the wave. So we became, pinned to that for a little while. If RPA is automating simple tasks, Rainbird is capable of extending that to more complex, human-centric, high-stakes reasoning tasks. And then we hit this world of large language models. We're in the Transformer paper. Those that are more technical know the Transformer architecture that LLMs are based on, these large language models that underpin tools like ChatGPT. When this paper was published, really everything changed. And we realized that this particular category of AI was going to be instrumental in enabling people to leverage a technology that they've struggled to trust to build a type of AI that they can trust. And so the business really pivoted into that, and we haven't looked back since.
And you've actually developed your own LLM model, is that correct, at the moment?
Yes, we have. Yeah, we have. So, central to what we do is we take knowledge, which is either going to be explicitly defined in some kind of regulation or policy or written procedure, as well as tacit knowledge that comes out of people's heads, the kind of philosophy, the grey tribal knowledge of what people do. And we encode all of this knowledge into knowledge graphs. And if you go back to the origins of Rainbird, we were building these knowledge graphs, these kind of holistic maps of knowledge by hand. Yeah. They were literally being hand cranked and were very time consuming. And of course, the task of putting knowledge into software, is known as knowledge engineering, has been around for many, many decades, but has always been very cost prohibitive. You've got to take experts away from doing their day job to get them to build these graphs. So, language models, as people know, is very good at writing content, very good at writing code, but not so good at reasoning. They're a very poor proxy for reasoning because that's not really what they're doing. They're sort of obviously producing text based on a balance of probabilities. There's not really any logic there. But we have trained, fine-tuned an LLM that's very capable of creating these knowledge graphs very quickly. So whereas a project maybe would take 4, 6, 8 weeks to build a graph that could recreate the knowledge of let's say, a particularly complex process, this is something that now can be done in minutes. And this accelerates the whole project lifecycle and deals with there's probably 2 or 3 challenges with this sort of technology. If you go back 20 years, language models solve all of these challenges, but one of those is the time that it takes to get knowledge into graphs. And it's been great to be able to release a solution in that space. Definitely, and something that you mentioned as well, in a different conversation we had, was that you're using LLM for two things really. One, like you mentioned, to kind of increase that speed of actually building the knowledge graph, but second of all then to be able to have that natural language kind of input and output as well. So you mentioned that it goes through kind of the decisioning process. You have a decision tree, and then you can also have that in natural language as well as an output, rather than it actually using the LLM to
provide a prediction or being probabilistic about what an answer could be.
Yeah, so if you imagine you've got all your knowledge in a graph, this holistic, reusable, multi-dimensional map of knowledge that can, once you've built it, can do lots of different things. You want to be able to talk to that. And again, if you go back to history, you had to be very explicit. If you had a concept of your graph called client and you happen to try and use the word customer, it's not going to know what you mean. Yeah. Well, language models are a fantastic natural language interpreter. So if you give a language model the graph, it's able to know what you're saying that's important within the context of that graph and extract the data you need into the graph. So the graph can do the reasoning with what's called a symbolic reasoning engine, this sort of mathematical powerhouse that knows how to reason over these graphs. And then, as you say, produce, I'll give you a slight correction on the word decision tree, but yes, evidence tree. It creates
evidence
like
tree, yes.
Yeah, proof tree, a kind of a chain of reasoning that explains how it solved the problem. And yes, you can turn, again, LLMs are very good at summarization. So you can turn this kind of chain of logic into a natural language explanation. So the great thing for customers is the interface can look exactly like ChatGPT, natural language in, natural language out. But unlike every other form of probabilistic AI, what's going on in Rainbird is rooted in reasoning logically over the knowledge that's important to you, your differential IP that you put into one of those knowledge graphs, and ensuring that your answer is precise, it's consistent. So if you ask it the same question 5 times, you're going to get the same answer, which is not what you get with large language models. Yeah. And you get not a prediction as to what the reasoning might be, but the actual chain of reasoning that led to the decision. And for high-stakes applications like regulated decisions, that's the difference between being able to deploy this technology and not being able to deploy the technology.
Exactly. And it's key as well that it actually provides a confidence level around them. It doesn't give you just one answer. It provides that evidence tree, which is really important. So it kind of puts not the onus, but it gives the actual end user that kind of help rather than giving it a definite answer if it isn't sure.
Yeah, and I think, nothing should take away from the autonomy that experts should have to be the ultimate arbiter of a decision. Yeah. I don't think necessarily that, replacing everything that people do is it by any means even the peak of this direction of travel of this technology. But actually, if you're able to provide look, here's the answer, here's how sure I am, here's what other answers may have been, but I've decided and why they're not the right answer. Here is an explanation as to how I worked each of those answers. And if there's any uncertainty that's crept in, I can trace that right back to what that uncertainty came from. So maybe there were 10 pieces of data that I needed to evaluate to make this decision. And you told me you were only somewhat sure of one of those. Well, surely that doubt in that piece of data should propagate through to how I describe the answer to you. So it's being able to be very specific and deliberate about explaining not just the answer, how sure it is, how you got there, why other answers are not the right answer, in a way that's really transparent and rooted in evidence. Yeah,
no, absolutely. The whole black box versus glass box is always a term that's kind of thrown around when discussing about Rainbird. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's a good question because black box has become a rather overloaded term and maybe a little bit contentious. But in essence, it's not possible when you're having any form of machine learning, of which large language models are obviously still based on machine learning. We now say traditional machine learning and these transformer large language models. But they are ultimately black box models. And what we mean by that is you're not able to understand how it's done what it's done. In fact, in some cases, it's very difficult even for the scientists that create these models to really understand why they're coming up with the answers. And actually, one major frontier model provider published some research into how their models are working. And when it describes its reasoning, it's very different in what it describes to what it's actually doing. So, all this technology is based on predictions, again, across a distribution of probabilities. And there's nothing in that whole world of data science and machine learning that actually relates to cause and effect. You don't even really have a word for causation in statistics. It's really about correlation. And even when we study statistics at school, we know that causation and correlation are very different things. So Rainbird really is a complementary technology. We love everything that LLMs can do, but we know that they can hallucinate. We know that they can make mistakes. We know we need to guardrail and we need to ground. And sometimes we need to not use the LLM as a proxy for reasoning. We need to use a different method, such as the one that I've described. But we also need to bring it into the light. And so, yes, we can't trust an LLM to make a complex decision because it can hallucinate, and that's an innate limitation that won't go away. When we get the new versions, it's not going to suddenly become precise and deterministic. It may improve, but you're still not going to get the determinism. That's something you can't fix. It's inherent in whether they work. But we can use it, can't we, to draft and then check. We can use it to write code, and we can also use it to write Rainbird code, to build Rainbird models that we can test and check. So we can leverage a black box model we don't trust to build a glass box model that we do trust. And because graphs are inherently transparent, we can see the connections, we can see the weights. We're able as experts to go and layer on the philosophy of our own expertise and build something that, for the first time in the history, really, of the last 25 years of AI being synonymous with machine learning, to actually deliver something that can be accountable for what it does.
Yeah, no, it's interesting stuff, and I think it's insightful as well, because people are using ChatGPT every day and just assuming that it can provide that input, and that you kind of just trust it, I suppose. And people who know that hallucinations exist, but might think that we'll only really notice it if it's a big dramatic kind of change from what they might be expecting. And I think I always go back to your example about giving it a really complex maths problem, and you were getting a different answer every time you put it in, while in Rainbird you'd get the exact answer, or it would tell you if it can't do it, but it wouldn't just make something up, which is great. You mentioned as well when we were discussing last week about you've kind of seen those two trends around the guardrailing using Rainbird, where you've seen it where it's kind of a safety net for when people are using LLMs, or you can actually bring it at the start of the process, which is actually deploying it and implementing it from the start, where you don't really need then that kind of safety net towards the end.
Yeah, that's worth covering, I think, because there are these two patterns that have emerged of project. Look, everybody, maybe it's best to put it for your listeners into the context of agentic AI, because everybody's very focused on agents at the moment. I think with some of the really senior AI leaders that we work with across big firms, they've got one foot in the agentic AI camp, just like they had one foot in the RAG camp. The other one's out because we're still not sure that this is necessarily going to prove itself. But there seems to be some power in this idea of having multiple agents deal with different parts of a process, and then have an agent that's dynamically being designed to run this process. I think, just to put a pin in it, but I think the issue of agency, of allowing models to go and take action, which of course is really what agentic AI is about, still it needs to have some pretty important reservations around whether that's going to be safe. But talking about these two patterns, look, most people are out there going, look, I built this LLM, I built this system, and I want to know how I can stop it from hallucinating. It's sort of doing what I want, but it's making mistakes, or I need to check it against some kind of regulatory framework, or check that it's not misbehaving. And they look for guardrails. And there are various different ways that you can guardrail what an LLM comes out with. You could, for example, say, look, it should come up with one of these two answers, and if it's not one of those two answers, I'm going to block the response. And of course, there's lots of other sophisticated sort of techniques. But even ChatGPT, if you look at ChatGPT, has lots of guardrails built into it. And the underlying GPT-4 model will behave very differently when you address it directly. So, if you imagine taking, let's say, a piece of regulation which cannot be breached, you can turn that into a knowledge graph using our own fine-tuned LLM, part of Rainbird Noesis. And then you can have that as a post-processor. So allow an LLM to do what it does best, create all this content, and then wash that through a Rainbird graph to identify in a very nuanced way whether or not that's breached some kind of guideline. And if it has, then go back and say to the LLM, actually, this isn't compliant. Do you want to amend your answer? Or you can take over, and or you can escalate it. But you then have control. But that basic pattern is predicated on allow an LLM to potentially make a mistake and then trap that mistake with some kind of safety net. And lots of people are looking for that. And Rainbird has precedents working in that space. One of the use cases we work on is marketing company in the pharmaceutical space creates lots of marketing content for drug companies. This is a high stakes arena where you have a regulatory framework you have to adhere to. And the cost of creating marketing copy now is trending towards zero, right? Because LLMs are really good. ChatGPT is great at creating marketing copy, but it's created an exponentially more complex compliance problem. So you can imagine Rainbird as you're in there creating your copy, whether that's in Word or you're using it in Photoshop, that actually it's literally checking what you're typing or what an LLM is producing to make sure it adheres to some kind of regulatory framework. That's a really good pattern where creating content's functional for an LLM. It can be creative and do that lovely sort of design stuff, but you still need a guardrail. And then the other pattern is, which is, actually the majority of the work we've done, is if you need to make a high stakes decision, like a lending decision or an insurance claims decision, something that's, it's not enough to make a prediction, you need to make a judgment, then you can just put all the knowledge you need to do that into a graph and have the graph do the work instead of the LLM. So you use the LLM for understanding the question you're asking and maybe ingesting some data. You reason over the graph, and then you take the answer with its chain of reasoning, that proof tree, evidence tree, turn that back into natural language, and you avoid the need to have the LLM do any reasoning at all. So the first one is called, graph first reasoning, and the second one is kind of post LLM verification or guardrailing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it was interesting kind of discussing with you last week about the patterns that you kind of saw from those projects as well. So it can be used in a lot of different ways at different stages in clients' journeys as well. Like you said, they could have been early adopters to implementing LLMs and then kind of looking to provide that layer of security, maybe post LLM, but then others identifying that it's something they want to do, but going with Rainbird from the start, I suppose. Yeah,
and I think one of the other things to bear in mind is lots of people think they can't get value from AI because their data's not in shape. Mm-hmm. And because Rainbird is knowledge first rather than data first, if you've got some kind of policy or procedure that people are using to do work, you can start your project with that. I think part of the challenge with an LLM-only approach is because they are effectively trained on, to all intents and purposes, the public internet, they're full of knowledge that is not your knowledge. So, when you spin up like if you use ChatGPT, it's we sometimes joke that it sounds a bit like a consultant because it's always confident, but is only sometimes right. But it will always give you an answer. It's always going to come up with something.
Exactly, yeah.
And you only know if that's the truth or whether that's complete fiction.
Yeah.
We always use the word bullshit, and I mean that in the technical sense because it's defined as convincing sounding nonsense.
Yeah.
That's only going to be it's going to pull that from the bowels of how it's trained to fill any gaps in what you're doing. Actually, most businesses will sacrifice that general purpose nature of what that LLM can do, like ChatGPT, in order to get precision in a narrow domain. So if you're building a graph that becomes your defendable sort of digitization of your business knowledge for this AI age, as LLMs get better, they can still pull knowledge from a knowledge graph. You can make better knowledge graphs, but just don't rely on a technology that's not the right shape for reasoning. That's the main thing.
No, 100%. Some of the examples you've mentioned about kind of the healthcare sector and also financial and regulation and compliance, is there certain kind of maybe case studies or examples that kind of really proved the benefit of Rainbird from your experience in those different clients?
Yeah, we've got lots of examples and lots of case studies. I think the first thing to note is, if you look at all of the work that we do, it all tends to be in high stakes decisioning, right? There's lots of technology out there that can provide a co-pilot type experience that can provide, an incremental improvement to the efficiency of general purpose work. Mm-hmm. That's not really what we do. What we're doing is being able to reason over really important areas in regulated sectors where it's not an option. I mean, things like sanctions checking or lots of banking and financial controls. But some of our case studies have really delivered amazing results. We do a lot of work in insurance. We do work in law. There's one of our clients, those two worlds collide, where Rainbird is identifying fraud. It's helping manage property claims, and delivering, many magnitudes of efficiency improvement, but also raising the quality of work that's being done. We've done a lot of work in accounting, so that would be tax, audit, advisory, and even within tax, it's tax compliance and tax advisory. these are areas where senior partners are being freed up to provide a more empathic human service for customers.
Yeah.
Because, our AI-powered tools can do more of that work. But what they all have in common is we care about the efficiency, of course, because automation should bring incremental efficiency and all businesses are under pressure to reduce cost. But actually, we can produce better quality answers and we can produce evidence to ensure that regulators are going to stay off your back. And so, whilst there's a wide range of use cases, when we talk about banking, financial services, insurance, healthcare, there's one thing these all have in common, which is the consequence of error is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And you've got a regulator that's likely to beat you up if you get it wrong.
Yeah. And it's, I suppose, the perfect use case as well for what you were saying with Rainbird. I'm intrigued to kind of go back to earlier on in the days of Rainbird and actually kind of growing that company as well from the ground up. Obviously yourself and Ben would have been pivotal at the start, but then the team starts to grow. You have interest in projects along the way. We spoke back in January in Germany. We had a workshop about kind of onboarding and bringing people and engaging people within Roboyo and upskilling them within Rainbird. And you kind of dropped in a couple of gems about some of the projects and past experience that you've had. Any that you want to kind of share in particular?
Yeah, there are some I'd love to talk about that I can't talk about, of course. But we've done some really interesting things. We were, in our early days, we were pulled in to do a project to try and capture the knowledge of the engineers that worked at Abbey Road Studios. So at that particular time, there was a whole raft of engineers that were literally the people that put together the Beatles sound and helped record those albums were all retiring, and nobody else quite understood all this knowledge about how this works. So we basically used knowledge engineering techniques to capture the little nuggets of wisdom that they had. You can imagine putting these into decision trees and little kind of rules engines, but we built one of these knowledge graphs that can make really powerful holistic decisions that enabled that knowledge to be retained in the organization. Yeah. We were also pulled in at one time to work with one of the world's leading collaborative negotiators. He was a gentleman who actually was part of the team that negotiated the release of Nelson Mandela. Wow. And most people, when they want to retire, they might go and write a book, but he wanted to create an app.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time. Yeah,
ahead of his time, absolutely. Yeah. And so we worked with him and a big corporation to incorporate some of his knowledge in collaborative negotiation to be able to have anybody have a little bit of that skill, or certainly that knowledge in their pocket to know how to deal with complex scenarios. Mm-hmm. So there's some of the maybe the more superficially exciting things that we've done.
High stakes,
yeah. But another one that we're very proud of is we did a lot of work with the National Health Service during COVID. Yeah. We were chosen to develop a risk assessment tool that was used by hundreds of thousands of frontline workers to determine how likely it was that they might be damaged by COVID in the early stages of the pandemic, based on a whole bunch of factors. So COVID, unfortunately, would discriminate against you based on your biological sex, your ethnicity, your age, as well as your entire medical history. Mm-hmm. And this is an area where the knowledge was evolving every day, but the NHS had a task to try and help enable managers to understand the risks that individual people in the workforce were facing. So, if you were a receptionist behind a pane of plastic glass, you're a very different risk to if you're working on a COVID ward. And they needed to move people into different risk environments according to those factors. And we built this tool. It went from being literally an idea to going live into production in 8 days. And it's hard to imagine how you can do that in the circumstance other than COVID, when you needed to hustle. Yeah. But it also talks to how quickly this technology is to work with. And, you didn't have to train it from data and go into a big, long testing cycle. You took the latest research. Had a champion that was the expert that was responsible for occupational health for the NHS service nationally. And in 3 2-hour sessions, we built a model that outperformed the expert on a bench of test cases.
Yeah, crazy.
Because it doesn't get tired or make probabilistic mistakes, right? Rainbird's very consistent. And so we've been lucky that we've had some high stakes work that we've been able to focus on. And even today we're working on projects that represent hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of decisioning across financial service markets, as well as more high stakes decisioning in healthcare particularly in the US, as well as, one or two more mundane projects. But there's lots more exciting stuff coming up as well that I hope at some point we'll be able to talk about.
Good stuff. Yeah, no, I was keen to kind of touch on some of those projects from the past. But yeah, I suppose we've talked about kind of what the value and the solution of Rainbird, some of the different industries that it can be effective in. What are sort of some of the challenges that you've faced when you're kind of bringing this up with clients, or even in the implementation phase? For example, you mentioned earlier on about, the time from the SME and the amount that they have to kind of, I suppose, share within those sessions, and that's going to be sped up with the LLM that you've developed. But in general, is there anything in particular that kind of you get pushback as when you actually bring this forward as an idea?
Not so much now. But I think it's fair to say that, over the last 10 years, we've had plenty of resistance.
Yeah.
Most of which is around education. I mean, Ben and I actually created a couple of videos, maybe must be 6-7 years ago now. One was just called The History of AI, and the other was called The Future of AI, which are on permanent exhibit at the Cambridge Museum of Computing, I think, just as a piece of content to try and help people understand what AI means, because it means different things to different people. But I think, definitely the three biggest barriers, as we've said, one was getting SME time. Now we're able to accelerate that because of LLMs. Two, talking to these models in natural language. Well, LLMs have been the missing jigsaw piece to that puzzle. And the third thing is we still want models to be able to learn, right? We want the models to be able to take the data that they've seen. And in our case, our technology is capable of recommending improvements to these models as well. So, but generally speaking, I think the big providers, and I'm not going to name them, but the big providers in the AI space today make a lot of noise. And we're in a sort of a series of hype cycles, micro hype cycles. So it's nice to see now, actually on Gartner's hype cycle, which anybody can go out and Google and see that generative AI. So generative AI has now sort of gone over this the top of the hype cycle, and it's now entering the trough of disillusionment. But of course, you've got RAG and you've got Agentic, you've got other things coming up here. But everything always follows this path. And ultimately, it's about being able to demonstrate value. And one of the things I think that we do very well now is we help clients find a safe way of being able to build a lighthouse, something that actually is real, can absolutely, is embeddable in the business, that can make a difference today, but it acts as a beacon for what's possible, because lots of businesses spend lots of money building POCs. And actually, outside of a few RAG solutions, very few of those have got into production because of these issues of precision, consistency, and explainability. So finding something that can be built, even if it doesn't have the biggest value equation, that acts as a beacon of education for what's possible, definitely makes a big difference for us. And so we work quite hard with our clients and partners to find those examples, because once that's understood, and that people realize that, some of the Kool-Aid that's being drunk around what the hype that's there isn't necessarily that helpful. And it's always okay because there's going to be another thing and another thing. Is GPT-5 going to fix it? Is GPT-6 going to fix it? Well, it's not going to fix precision and determinism and actually an explainability. And if you care about your intellectual IP, we work with some very big companies, like Big Four type companies, right? These guys have been around for hundreds of years. They've got huge institutional knowledge that they're trusted on, right? But their model has been to sell their time and their trust. Well, the cost of doing time-based work is trending towards zero. So that puts trust in focus, right? And yet, if all the AI we use can't be trusted, then trust is being put at risk as well. So there's some sort of existential questions that are in the market that I think we're helping to solve.
I'll ask you about them later.
Okay, but I think it really focuses on building small beacons that intellectually you can look at what that's doing and go, well, now I understand. Now we can do that. We can do this thing that is actually part of that big existential imperative that we need to go solve.
No, definitely. I think it's an interesting approach because it's something that we see in all the kind of services and offerings that we would do as well at Roboyo with the different automation technologies. You need to find something that you can provide some value with initially, like that lighthouse that you were speaking about, and that really plays into the buy-in within the customer and within the client and getting people interested, and people say, oh, what's that? Like that might be of value to my team. And it also helps with that change management side of things as well, because if that adoption's high, if people are happy to actually bring it in, then there is more opportunity to find that efficiency in different areas. So it's definitely a good approach.
I think it's important. I think one of the things I think is really great about our partnership is people have to be taken on the journey. AI is not something that can just be done to people.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of the market now realizes that it needs a strategy. It needs to figure out that trust is a part of that strategy, but it also demands an empathic approach to change. This is going to change the work that people are doing. And therefore, the partnership of the technology plus the professional service business that has that empathic approach to change and helping people get their strategy right is all really key to our joint customers getting value.
No, absolutely. In terms of the future, when you're looking at Rainbird and its applicability, and you've gone from a company that started off where LLMs weren't even a big thing, now they're in a kind of an important and imperative part of what the product is. Where do you kind of see that going now over the next few years and continuously developing?
Yeah, good question. I mean, people forget their AI history. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, AI wasn't about machine learning and data at all. It was about rules and knowledge representation. It was an era of expert systems. And businesses and governments were in a hype cycle then.
Yeah.
I mean, governments were literally putting $1 billion, the US government, Japanese, fifth generation project, the UK government put vast sums of money into AI then. And then the challenges with that era of AI, which we've already described, that we are now solved, push that into a winter, and then we end up with this era of what was known as sub-symbolic, became known as machine learning. Surely, if we can pull enough data together, we can get a model to decide on it on its own, and that became the zeitgeist. And we had this sort of data fetish, and all the rules stuff kind of disappeared. I think what's really interesting when you look forward from here is what we might call hybrid AI or neurosymbolic AI. There's lots of different terms for it.
You're scaring people now, probably.
Oh, I know, absolutely. All these new buzz phrases. But actually, is the idea that, again, AI was never one thing. It was always a collection of different technologies working together. And actually, if we can take all of the attributes of that era of AI that was about knowledge and knowledge representation, and we can take everything that's great about this current era of machine learning and large language models, we can combine these techniques together to have our cake and eat it, right? So we can have the precision, determinism, and explainability that is synonymous with rules and knowledge-based systems, but we can also have the natural language interface and the natural language wrangling and the superior capabilities that LLMs can bring. And if we can have them both cover each other's weaknesses in a configuration, then we can have everything we ever wanted. And I think that's what's exciting for me about the next 10 years. I think the other thing that's really key is knowledge management has become trendy again, right? Lots of businesses have tried to spin up knowledge management projects over many decades to just get all their knowledge in one place so that people can refer to it. But keeping that stuff up to date, keeping that relevant and being able to leverage it, it's never been very easy to get value. Because institutional knowledge is what drives, if you're going to build an AI solution, it needs to be making decisions based on your view of the world, not on public training.
Yeah.
And so knowledge management's become cool again. And there's no better way of representing knowledge than in knowledge graphs, which is the technology that we use for knowledge representation. So you've got all these various different things coming together for the future, but not just focusing on getting data in order, although that's important, but getting knowledge represented in graphs. And, businesses want to be like a boat floating on the ocean of this rising tide of large language models and generative AI. You don't want the next model to wipe out all the engineering you've done. If you're just prompt engineering and fine tuning, then the next time a model comes out, you've got to basically potentially do that again. It's not necessarily going to be lasting, and it's definitely not going to be deterministic. But if you build your knowledge into graphs, they're like boats floating on the ocean. Every time LLMs get better, you get to build better graphs, talk to them in a more natural way, extract data into them, and you're building a future-proof layer that enables you to take the best bit of LLMs, the best bit of machine learning and neural networks and their ability to learn, the best bit of knowledge representations and rules representation, and build digital solutions for the future that have trust baked in.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a point you mentioned around which kind of resonated with me from the experience I've had with clients as well, is bringing them on a journey of AI or technology kind of improvement in general. How do you kind of deal with those conversations? Because there's a lot around expectation management at the moment, where there was such a hype around ChatGPT when it came out, and because it was so easy for everyone and anyone to use it, that was the level was kind of set there in terms of, well, it's literally telling me what I can have for breakfast tomorrow morning, but this might not be helping my business at all. And maybe they need to start with a process excellence, or maybe they need to start with some simple automations first and then going into something really, really complex in AI. You mentioned there's lots of different facets within it, and AI has been called lots of different things over the years, with even RPA being coined as AI back in the day. How do you kind of bring them on that journey and kind of explain that to them?
So I think some of this is in not being, advising people to not be distracted by the interests of the big frontier providers. Everybody's very focused on artificial general intelligence, right? If you look at, a lot of these providers, they're trying to build an all-purpose AI that can do anything. And that's of limited value to a business. If you're responsible for tax compliance, or you're responsible for insurance underwriting, or you're responsible for mortgage lending, you again will trade all of that general purpose nature, which actually just pulls the model away from what you want it to focus on. They'll trade that general purpose nature for a narrow solution. And I would say that pretty much every example of AI through history that's ever added value to a business was inherently narrow. It was a tool being designed to do a specific task.
Yeah.
We know our sat nav's not going to be something that we need to talk to about other things. It just does its job, right? So I think that's definitely part of the communication is to be able to focus, but also to be able to accept that if I build a narrow tool that can do one thing, it'd be quite good if it can talk to other tools that I'm building in parallel areas. Yeah. So it can still be future-proof, but actually, sidestepping the general purpose nature, which I think as a consumer is really exciting, this idea of having an assistant that can help me with everything, but separating that from a business objective, which is I need to be able to underwrite risk in a way that's superior to my competitors for lower cost and give my customer a better customer experience. That's what they really care about.
Good stuff. So just to kind of finish up, James, you mentioned about how you kind of see Rainbird developing over the next few years. In your own personal opinion, are you optimistic about the future when it comes to AI and the developments within it? Are you pessimistic? Is there some things that you're kind of concerned about out there that that you think could be a possible risk? Or what's your general outlook when you kind of look at this whole topic in general?
No, that's a big question. A big question. Yeah. So yeah, it's a good question because, is this a utopia we're heading towards, or is it a dystopia? And look, I think generally speaking, I should caveat this by saying I'm a reasonably optimistic person.
Yeah.
But some of the shifts we've seen are greater than I expected to see in my lifetime, and I may have some more grey hair than you, but I've still got plenty of life left in me. It's interesting. I think almost. I'll give you an example. My two youngest daughters both work in the creative sector. So one's a university studying photography and graphic design, and the other one is an illustrator. And I'm sometimes asked, how do you feel about all this AI that's coming out? I mean, even this week we've seen big improvements in ChatGPT's image generation. It can now do text and things that it couldn't do before. And you go, well, you can't argue that that's not going to completely disrupt the graphic design market. I mean, the next marketing person that I hire is going to do the work of a team 5 years ago because of the tooling that we have. So I think, people have to have this mindset to not be scared of the technology, that it's definitely to be seen as tooling that we have to get comfortable with. There's the old adage that was doing the rounds that says, AI won't take your job, but somebody that uses it better than you might.
Yeah.
And so we have to encourage people. But, I'm more comfortable my daughters being in the creative than I would be them being a lawyer or an accountant. Yeah. Because, the sectors that have relied on peddling just expertise are going to have to transform themselves pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So I think, I'm optimistic generally. I have a view that I don't think we're going to achieve AGI out of this, by my definition, out of this current generation of LLM development. I think there are new things we haven't begun to figure out yet to enable that to happen. I'm not sure the scaling laws will continue to apply over the next few years, and that they're going to exponentially continue to get better. And I don't think that direction of travel is going to deliver the three things that businesses really need, which are precision. You can probably recite it now: precision, determinism, and explainability. I'm just going to
write it on the wall.
Yeah, you can just caption it under this video. Precision, determinism, and explainability are absolutely key. And to be able to find a way of embedding the IP that makes one company, your company, special in a layer that can float on the rising tide of AI, and take compliance and risk seriously. I mean, these are things that really matter. I'd be more concerned if Rainbird didn't exist, because the world needs guardrails for AI. And there aren't many technologies out there that can do a really comprehensive job of that in a way that's intrinsically human. And I think our ability to take, the entire raft of legislation and regulation and turn that into something that's computable to AI and build that compliance officer within the AI, that's a capability the world really needs. And I feel lucky that I'd like to say it was all foresight, but I feel very lucky that we were able to get a sniff of early that the world would need AI it could trust, because this has been a decade's work building our tech stack to be able to do this. But the fact that it's enterprise grade, it's deployed at scale, and we have the kind of clients we have, means there's no risk about deploying this kind of technology. It's ready today and it's well evidenced. It's validated by analysts that write about us. We've been named major vendor here and various other things. So it gives, not just a safety net, but an approach out of our partnership and for our mutual clients to really differentiate in a world where a lot of AI solutions are going to look the same unless you can take the essence of what makes you special forward, as I said, with trust baked in.
Definitely. I think that's a great place to finish up. James, really appreciate your time. I think it's always great to have a chat, and I think getting to know a bit more about Rainbird, sharing that with the audience as well, and seeing your view on the world is always great. So thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Niall, for having me on.